privatisation into public services, and that's an agenda which is being aggressively promoted by the Tories now, who plan to introduce £200 billion worth more of PFI contracts over the life of this government. And the reality is that they don't decrease public sector costs. In fact, they increase them by many multiples. And even Andrew Terry, who's a Tory MP on the Treasury Select Committee, has said that the PFI rips off the taxpayer while delivering massive profits for the private companies involved. And the cost of these contracts is causing huge problems for our public services. In Britain at the moment, the majority of NHS trusts are struggling to keep up with their PFI payments. And last year, 7 had to be bailed out in order to make those payments to the tune of £1.5 billion. £1.5 billion going directly into the profits of these companies. And we shouldn't be deluded as to the nature of the companies which are behind these PFI projects. It's not the small local contractors who benefit from these projects. 75% of PFI contracts are connected directly to massive offshore infrastructure funds who are out to make as much profit and to bleed our public services dry. And they actually put pressure on small contractors to cut corners and to decrease costs and to attack the conditions of construction workers. And so we've seen the bizarre situation where we've had schools built in Northern Ireland under PFI where the corridors are too narrow for 2 people to walk side by side up these corridors because of their cost-cutting measures. And after paying huge amounts of money for the construction of these buildings, the public sector, the public then have nothing to show for it because these buildings are still owned by these offshore investment funds, not by the people. And we've had situations where in colleges and schools in Northern Ireland and in Britain as well, teachers can't put posters up on the walls of their classrooms in case the blue tack damages the paint on the walls, which are still owned by private sector companies. And whenever the contracts run out, these companies are free to sell on these buildings if they don't want to renew their contracts with the public sector, and they're obliged to give 0% of the money that they get from that back to the public sector, despite the massive investment put in by taxpayers. PFIs have been aggressively promoted by the Assembly Executive since it was being established, whether it was dominated by the SDLP and the UP or now by the DUP and Sinn Féin. For example, the new plush hospital in Enniskillen, which is designed so it could be privatised at a later date, that private healthcare can be introduced into it, was built on the basis of PFI. And back in 2010, whenever they did their comprehensive spending review and agreed to cut £4.3 billion from public services, which has led to huge unemployment and the devastation of our local economy. They also agreed to ring-fence over £10 billion to fund existing PFI and PPP contracts, £10 billion, again, to go directly into the profits of these huge funds. Whenever this motion was originally submitted, it called for the abolition of PFI and for all existing PFI projects, buildings, to be brought into the public sector with compensation only on the basis of proven need to the investors. However, that was deemed to be contrary to part of what I think was a generally very good economic motion from the IEC, Motion 1, which calls for more public-private enterprise. So the motion has been redrafted to call on Unite to campaign to put political pressure on the Assembly Executive to renegotiate existing PFI contracts with those funds. We need to send a strong message to the Assembly Executive that we're really all in this together. Public sector workers have to tighten their belts, and the fat cats who dominate these hedge funds should have to tighten theirs as well. That's not going to be an easy task. We've seen over the past few years how shamefaced the rich are when it comes to defending their wealth. But I think if there is a campaign which exposes these companies and exposes the huge profits that they are making and the fact that they are sucking our public services dry, then we can make gains. And just to finish up, I think it is important that the motion doesn't just say try to get back money, which could then disappear into another black hole. It specifically calls for that money to then be invested into the development of social housing to provide jobs for some of the almost 25% of young people in Northern Ireland who are currently unemployed because of the austerity measures and the crisis, and also to provide homes for some of the 22,000 families in Northern Ireland who are currently in severe housing stress. So I propose this motion to conference.